before we begin this journey into one of the most disturbing chapters in American history, I'd like to invite you to leave a comment, letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. We're tracking how far these stories reach and at what hours they find their way to listeners like you. The year was 1884. While the rest of America pushed westward and upward into an age of industry and ambition, the remote valleys and hollows of the Ozark Mountains remained stubbornly untouched by time. In these ancient highlands, sprawling across southern Missouri and northern Arkansas, communities existed in near total isolation, islands of frontier life in a rapidly changing nation. Hidden among the mist-shrouded ridges of southwestern Missouri, about 42 miles from Springfield, near where the town of Branson would later rise, there sat a nameless settlement that appeared on no official map of the period. The locals called it simply the Basin, a natural bowl carved into the landscape by centuries of water and time. It was here that one of the most disturbing chapters in American history unfolded, a chapter that would remain buried in county archives for nearly 8 decades. The first documented mention of the Miller family appears in a census record from 1851. It notes the arrival of Josiah Miller, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children to the region from somewhere in Tennessee. The exact location was left deliberately vague. The census taker made a brief note. The family claimed to be seeking isolation for religious purposes. In that era, it was a common enough explanation to avoid further questioning. Local church records, recovered from the Methodist Episcopal congregation in nearby Hollister, contain a single reference to the Millers' arrival, describing them as peculiar in manner but firm in faith. That description, mundane as it seems, would later take on a far more ominous significance when viewed through the lens of subsequent events. They settled in a remote valley accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense forests of oak and hickory, crossing treacherous ravines carved by centuries of flowing water. According to land records filed in the Greene County Courthouse, Josiah purchased 156 acres for a surprisingly small sum from a homesteader named Ezekiel Porter. Porter, according to the bill of sale, was eager to depart these premises forthwith. What the records don't explain is why Porter departed so hastily. He abandoned improvements already made to the property, including a 2-room cabin and a partially constructed barn. A notation in the margin of the land transfer document, written in a different hand than the main text, reads simply, Porter claimed Hollow was wrong somehow. Payment accepted despite incompletion of terms. This cryptic note, discovered by researcher Dr. James Harrington in 1952, would later be seen as the first documented indication that something about the location itself inspired unease. Long before the Millers made it their home, Porter's subsequent whereabouts remained unknown until 1953, when Harrington discovered a death certificate from Sacramento, California, dated 1852. It identified an Ezekiel Porter who had reportedly fled the Devil's Own Hollow in Missouri. While it cannot be confirmed with absolute certainty that this was the same man who sold land to the Millers, the timing and the specific reference to a hollow in Missouri suggest a connection. What exactly Porter experienced during his time in the basin remains unknown, but his hasty departure and apparent flight to the opposite side of the continent hint at some profound disturbance. The Miller family itself presented few immediate causes for concern to the scattered neighbors and occasional travelers who encountered them during their early years in the Ozarks. Josiah Miller was described in multiple accounts as a stern but seemingly ordinary frontier patriarch. Bearded, taciturn, and self-sufficient. A letter from traveling minister Reverend Thaddeus Wilson, dated September 1852, and preserved in the archives of the Springfield Ministerial Association, describes meeting Josiah on the road to Hollister. I encountered a man of imposing stature and serious mien, who identified himself as Miller. When I inquired as to the welfare of his family and offered to visit their homestead for prayer, he declined firmly, but without rudeness, stating that they kept their own faith in their own way. This insistence on religious self-sufficiency wasn't particularly unusual in the frontier communities of mid-19th century America. Denominational distinctions often blurred, and family-centered worship was common. What would later prove significant, however, was the Millers' gradual withdrawal from even these limited social interactions. By 1855, according to local merchant records, Josiah's visits to town had decreased from monthly to quarterly. By 1860, he appeared only twice a year, always alone, or accompanied only by adult males presumed to be his sons. By 1884, the Miller homestead had grown considerably from its humble beginnings. Tax records indicate the presence of a main house, 3 smaller cabins arranged in a rough semicircle around the central dwelling, a barn, smokehouse, and various outbuildings spread across the property. A hand-drawn map included with the 1880 tax assessment shows the layout of these structures, along with notations indicating cultivated fields, an orchard of apple trees, and a spring that served as the property's water source. When rain washed out the only access road in October of 1884, it set in motion a series of events that would eventually expose what many researchers later described as a society unto itself, governed by its own incomprehensible rules. The Miller property sat nestled in a natural depression, surrounded by steep ridges on 3 sides, with elevations rising more than 800 feet from the valley floor. This created what geologists refer to as a box canyon. The only entrance was through a narrow path to the east that followed the course of what locals called Stillwater Creek, a tributary of the James River. But what makes this case so profoundly disturbing isn't the physical isolation of the Miller land. It was what decades of that isolation had produced. The geography created what amounted to a natural fortress, sheltering the inhabitants from outside scrutiny. Dr. James Harrington, who documented the case in his unpublished 1953 study, Isolated Communities of the American Interior, described the location as pathologically perfect for the development of a closed society. His field notes, discovered among his effects after his disappearance in 1957, contain hand-drawn maps of the property that reveal just how complete this isolation was. The acoustic properties of the basin are particularly noteworthy. Harrington wrote, "Sounds do not travel beyond the ridge line, nor do outside sounds penetrate easily into the valley. The effect is one of complete sensory isolation from the wider world." Local folklore collected by its Randolph in his 1933 work, Ozark Mountain Tales, includes stories predating the Millers' arrival about the basin being a place where sounds don't belong. Though Randolph attributed such accounts to the superstitious, neither often early than any accusers, rather than any acoustic anomaly. And worstic anomaly. What we know of daily life at the Miller homestead comes primarily from 3 sources. The Journal of Margaret Miller, discovered in 1943 during renovation of the Greene County Courthouse. It had apparently been misfiled among property records. Testimony given by local postmaster Elias Whitmore to the Missouri State Police in November 1884. And most disturbingly, the medical examiner's reports compiled following what would later be referred to in hushed tones as the intervention. These documents, along with fragmentary correspondence and county records, allow us to piece together the events that culminated in what one official report described simply as conditions inconsistent with recognized human society. Margaret Miller's journal begins as a fairly conventional account of frontier life. Entries detailing the challenges of establishing a homestead in the remote Ozark wilderness. Nevertheless, multiple sources confirmed that the Miller property existed in a state of unusual physical and sensory isolation from surrounding communities. This created conditions ideal for the development of practices divergent from societal norms. Early entries from 1851 through 1853 describe clearing land, planting crops, and interactions with occasional travelers who passed through the region. Josiah believes we have found our Eden, she wrote in April 1852. Here, away from the corrupting influence of towns and false churches, we may raise our children according to the true word. These early entries suggest that religious separatism was indeed the family's initial motivation for seeking isolation, though the specific nature of their beliefs remains unclear from the text. What is clear is that the Millers brought with them a particular interpretation of biblical teachings that would later serve as justification for their increasingly apparent practices. An entry from August 1852 references Josiah's readings from the old books, noting that he finds in them the truth about the patriarchs and their ways, which the modern churches have abandoned. This cryptic reference to old books appears repeatedly in the early journal entries. It suggests that Josiah possessed texts beyond the standard Bible, perhaps apocryphal works or obscure religious commentaries that informed his developing worldview. A notable shift occurs in the journal around 1857, when references to outside contact become increasingly rare. Entries focus more on internal family dynamics and Margaret's growing concern about her husband's increasingly strict control over their daily lives. Josiah forbids the children from speaking to travelers now, she wrote in June 1857. He says the outside world carries corruption in its very breath. By 1860, the journal entries mention no contact with outsiders at all. This suggests that the family's isolation had become nearly complete. The journal also documents a gradual change in religious practices within the family. Early entries mention conventional prayers and Bible readings, but by 1858, Margaret writes of Josiah's new rituals and ceremonies at the full moon. An entry from September 1858 reads, Josiah has taken to leading the family in what he calls the old worship. The children must stand in a circle while he reads from his private book and makes marks on their foreheads with ash. I fear this is not the Christianity we brought with us from Tennessee. This suggestion of developing ritual practices unique to the family aligns with later observations about the Millers' unusual religious beliefs. Perhaps most disturbing are the journal entries that begin to appear around 1861, when the oldest Miller daughter, Rebecca, would have been approximately 16 years old. Margaret writes, Josiah has announced that Rebecca is to be joined soon. When I asked to whom, he looked at me as if I had spoken nonsense and said, to the family, of course, as it was in the beginning. I do not understand his meaning, but his eyes frighten me into silence. Subsequent entries become increasingly cryptic on this subject. References to Rebecca's preparation and the joining ceremony, but never explicitly stating what these terms meant. By 1863, the journal contains the first clear indication of Margaret's awareness that something fundamentally wrong was occurring within her family. What Josiah calls purity, I can no longer recognize as such, she wrote. The children born now carry the mark of our sin in their very flesh. Yet he sees this as proof of divine favor, saying that we are returning to the original state before the world was corrupted. This entry suggests that by this point, the consequences of what appears to have been multi-generational inbreeding were becoming physically apparent in newborn children. By 1884, the family that had arrived 3 decades earlier had grown considerably. Baptismal records from a church in nearby Hollister show that Margaret Miller had given birth to 7 more children after their arrival in the Ozarks. The last recorded birth occurred in 1863. These records exist only because Josiah Miller apparently brought each newborn child to be baptized, a practice he discontinued after 1863 for reasons not documented. What these records fail to show is what became of these children once they reached maturity, or why no marriages involving Miller offspring were ever recorded in county registries across Missouri or Arkansas. The absence of these records would later prove to be the first thread that, when pulled, began to unravel the dark tapestry of the Miller legacy. The baptismal records themselves contained subtle indications that something unusual was occurring within the family. Notations beside several of the later baptisms include comments from the officiating ministers such as, "Child appears unwell," or "Infant shows unusual features." In one case from 1862, the minister wrote, "Requested medical attention for the child which the father refused. May God have mercy on this family." These notes suggest that signs of genetic abnormalities were becoming apparent even to outside observers during Josiah's increasingly rare interactions with the community. Elias Whitmore, who served as postmaster in Hollister from 1855 until his death in 1892, provided the most comprehensive outside perspective on the Miller family. His testimony, given to investigators in November 1884, describes how the Millers would appear in town only 3 or 4 times a year, always arriving with loaded wagons of ginseng root, animal pelts, and occasionally unusual carved items that found eager buyers among tourists visiting the region's newly established health spas. They kept to themselves. Whitmore stated, "Josiah did all the talking. The women, and there were several, never spoke. Not once in all the years I knew them. They kept their faces hidden under bonnets, even in the height of summer heat." Whitmore's testimony further notes that while Josiah would collect mail during these visits, he never posted any outgoing letters. This suggests the family maintained no correspondence with the outside world. He'd ask for any mail for Miller, Whitmore recalled, but there never was any, not once in nearly 30 years. When asked to elaborate on who the women accompanying Josiah were, Whitmore's testimony becomes notably vague, suggesting a reluctance to speak directly about what he may have observed. "There were resemblances," he said, "more resemblances than there ought to have been, if you take my meaning." Thomas Gardner, proprietor of the general store in Hollister, where the Millers conducted their infrequent business, provided additional testimony that aligns with Whitmore's account. "The old man Josiah, he aged like anyone else," Gardner stated. "But the women with him, they had a sameness about them that wasn't natural. Year after year, they looked too much alike, if you understand me." When pressed by investigators to clarify this statement, Gardner reportedly said, "I'm a God-fearing man. I don't like to speak ill without certainty. But there weren't enough different faces among them for how many there were." Gardner's sales records, preserved in the Taney County Historical Society archives, document the Millers' purchases over the years. Basic supplies like flour, salt, ammunition, and tools, but also notably large quantities of certain medical items like laudanum, camphor, and various patent medicines. A notation from 1876 indicates that Josiah purchased 6 bottles of Dr. Wilton's quieting syrup for nervous conditions, a preparation known to contain significant amounts of morphine. These purchases suggest possible attempts to manage pain or other symptoms among family members, perhaps related to the physical conditions later documented by medical examiners. The catalyst that finally exposed the Miller situation came in the form of an unusually heavy autumn rainstorm that lasted for nearly a week in October 1884. Meteorological records from the period describe it as the most substantial rainfall event recorded in the region since observations began in 1837. Precipitation exceeded 15 inches in some areas. The deluge caused Stillwater Creek to overflow its banks, washing away the narrow trail that connected the Miller property to the outside world. Landslides further isolated the basin. When Josiah failed to make his scheduled appearance to collect mail and supplies in early November, local merchant Thomas Gardner reportedly mentioned to Sheriff Robert Ledbetter that the old man hasn't come down from the hollow. According to court documents filed later, the sheriff initially dismissed any concerns, noting that those mountain folk often go months without showing their faces. It wasn't until December 3, 1884, when a hunting party led by James Holloway stumbled upon evidence of distress at the Miller property, that authorities were finally compelled to investigate. Holloway's written statement, preserved in county records, describes how his party, having taken a wrong turn while tracking deer, came upon a young woman, dirty and in considerable distress, wearing nothing but a tattered nightdress despite the December cold. The woman, who could not or would not speak, led them to the edge of the Miller property before fleeing back into the forest. Holloway's party observed from a distance what he described as figures moving about in a manner that struck us all as peculiar and troubling. Holloway's statement includes a detailed description of the woman that suggests physical abnormalities consistent with genetic disorders. Her eyes were set too wide apart, and her jaw had a peculiar underhung quality. Her hands were misshapen, with fingers of uneven length. Most disturbing was her gait. She moved in a shuffling manner, knees turned inward, as if her very skeleton had formed incorrectly. This clinical description, unusual for a layman in 1884, is explained by the fact that Holloway had studied medicine briefly at Washington University in Seattle, Louis, before returning to the Ozarks to manage his family's timber interests. Holloway's report also contains an observation that would later prove significant in understanding the Miller family's isolation. The woman appeared terrified, not merely of us, but of the forest itself. She kept looking at the trees as if they might come alive. It was the behavior of someone who had never been outside a confined space, someone to whom the open world was as alien and frightening as a different planet might be to us. This observation suggests that at least some members of the Miller family may have been kept in such complete isolation that they had never ventured beyond the confines of the basin. Upon their return to town, Holloway's report prompted Sheriff Ledbetter to organize what records refer to as a party of concerned citizens to investigate the Miller property. This group, consisting of the sheriff, 2 deputies, Dr. Elias Porter, the county physician, and 4 armed men from prominent local families, departed from Miller Hollow on December 4th. Their journey was complicated by the condition of the trail, which remained partially washed out from the October storms. According to the sheriff's official report, they were forced to abandon their horses approximately 2 miles from the property and proceed on foot through increasingly difficult terrain. What they discovered upon arriving at the homestead on December 5, 1884, was documented in official reports with clinical detachment. But the personal journal of Deputy Sheriff William Hayes, discovered among his effects after his death in 1912, provides a more visceral account of what the party encountered. The main house stood at the center of what I can only describe as a compound. Hayes wrote, "The approach was watched by figures in the windows of outlying cabins. These sentinels made no sound as we approached, but we could feel their eyes upon us. The smell reached us before we dismounted. An odor of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and something else I lacked the words to describe properly. Something wrong, Hayes's account goes on to describe how the investigating party was initially met with neither resistance nor welcome. This created an unsettling atmosphere of watchful silence as they approached the main house. Josiah Miller emerged from the main house as we approached. Hayes continued. He appeared much older than his years should have accounted for, with a long white beard reaching nearly to his waist and skin weathered to the texture of tanned leather. He showed no surprise at our arrival, nor any concern, but regarded us with the detached curiosity one might show an unusual insect. When Sheriff Ledbetter explained the purpose of our visit, to investigate reports of a woman in distress, the old man smiled in a manner that turned my blood cold. "My family suffers no distress," he said. "We are as God made us and wants us to be." Hayes's journal describes the interior of the main house in meticulous detail, noting the unusual arrangement of sleeping quarters. The upper floor was divided not into proper bedrooms, but into small cells, each secured with a wooden bar on the outside. Within these cells were crude pallets, many bearing evidence of restraint, ropes and leather straps fixed to the wall. Most disturbing was the central room, larger than the others, where we found the old woman, Margaret Miller, surrounded by what appeared to be a twisted attempt at feminine luxury. Faded ribbons hanging from the ceiling, crude drawings of flowers on the walls, and disturbing dolls fashioned from corn husks arranged in a semicircle around her bed. The official report states simply that, upon entry to the main dwelling, officers discovered 27 individuals of varying ages living in conditions of extreme squalor and moral degradation. What this sterile language conceals is revealed in Hayes's more candid account. The inhabitants showed physical characteristics suggesting shared parentage across what should have been separate family lines. Many exhibited malformations of the skull and limbs. Some could not speak, but made animal sounds when approached. Most disturbing were the evident signs of familial relationships that violated every natural law and human taboo. Hayes goes on to describe the difficulty the investigating party had in determining the exact relationships between the various inhabitants. When questioned, those who could speak identified themselves only as Miller, offering no given names or specific relationships. They referred to Josiah simply as father, regardless of apparent age, suggesting either a religious designation or a bloodline, so convoluted that conventional terms of relation had lost all meaning. The investigation of the property beyond the main house revealed further disturbing discoveries. The smaller cabins, Hayes wrote, appeared to serve specific functions within the family's isolated society. One contained only women and girls ranging in age from perhaps 5 years to 40, all engaged in repetitive craft work, weaving, sewing, and creating the strange dolls we had observed in the main house. Another housed what appeared to be a primitive school, with biblical texts written on slate boards and crude anatomical drawings that suggested a preoccupation with human reproduction. The third cabin served as what I can only describe as a nursery containing 7 infants and young children, attended by 2 women who bore such striking resemblance to each other that they might have been twins, though one appeared significantly older than the other. Dr. Elias Porter, the county physician called to examine the Miller family members, refused to include his complete findings in the official record. His report contains frequent redactions and allusions to conditions he declined to specify, out of consideration for public sensibility. However, his private medical journal, discovered after his suicide in 1887, contains detailed clinical observations of physical characteristics consistent with several generations of consanguineous relationships. I have observed in these subjects physical and apparent mental degeneration that can only result from sustained breeding among close blood relations. He wrote, "Some individuals show such extreme abnormalities that I question whether they can properly be classified according to established medical taxonomy." Porter's journal includes precise measurements and clinical descriptions of various physical anomalies observed among the Miller family members, including unusual cranial formations, asymmetrical facial features, polydactyly, extra fingers and toes, and various skeletal malformations. Most disturbing are his notes regarding the apparent ages and probable relationships of the individuals examined. Subject 14, female, approximately 16 to 18 years of age, shows physical characteristics, suggesting she is both daughter and granddaughter to Subject 1. Josiah Miller, Subject 7, male, approximately 30 years of age, appears to be both son and half brother to Subject 14, while simultaneously being son and grandson to Subject 1. These clinical observations suggest a complex web of inbreeding that had persisted for multiple generations. Porter's notes also document the medical conditions prevalent among the family members, including high rates of seizure disorders, various developmental delays, and compromised immune function. Many subjects show evidence of chronic infections left untreated. He wrote, particularly of the respiratory system and skin. The overall health of the population suggests a gradual decline in viability that would, if continued, eventually result in complete non-viability of offspring. This clinical assessment supports the theory that by 1884, the Miller family's isolation and inbreeding practices had reached a point where they threatened the continued existence of the family itself. Of particular note in Porter's private journal is his description of what he termed the book, a manuscript he observed in Josiah Miller's possession. The subject refers constantly to a leather-bound volume written in a hand I cannot identify as any known language. When questioned about this text, he becomes animated, claiming it contains the original truth from before the corruption. He permits no one else to touch this book and keeps it on his person at all times. This mysterious text was never recovered or officially documented. It apparently disappeared during the chaos of the family's removal from the property. Its contents and origin remain one of the many unresolved questions surrounding the Miller case. The patriarch Josiah Miller was by then an elderly man of approximately 70 years. When questioned by authorities, he reportedly showed no recognition that the living arrangements he had established violated any societal norms. According to Sheriff Ledbetter's testimony, when informed that he was being taken into custody, Josiah responded with genuine confusion. "For what crime? This is my family. This is our way." Further questioning revealed a disturbing worldview that had developed during the family's decades of isolation. The old man spoke of purifying the bloodline and returning to the ways of the patriarchs. Hayes wrote in his journal, he cited biblical examples of familial marriages and spoke of his family as chosen to preserve what others had corrupted. Most disturbing was his evident pride in what he had created, as if the visible degeneration of his line was proof of its increasing perfection, rather than its ruin. Hayes's journal includes a detailed account of Josiah's explanation of his family structure, which the old man provided with no apparent awareness of its aberrant nature. He described what he called the circles of joining, wherein each generation was bound back to previous generations to strengthen what he termed the sacred essence. When asked directly if he understood that such practices resulted in the visible abnormalities among his younger family members, he responded that these were not defects, but the emergence of the original form before the world's corruption. He seemed genuinely unable to perceive the suffering his practices had inflicted on his own descendants. Margaret Miller, by then in her 60s, was found in an upstairs room of the main house, bedridden and seemingly unaware of her surroundings. Dr. Porter's examination indicated that she suffered from advanced senility inconsistent with her chronological age, suggesting either premature mental deterioration or possibly the effects of long-term trauma. Her journal, later recovered, contains entries that abruptly end in 1869, suggesting that her lucidity had failed long before the authorities' intervention. The final legible entry reads, "The children have children now. Josiah says this is how we remain pure. God help me. I no longer know what purity means." Earlier entries in Margaret's journal hint at her growing awareness of and resistance to her husband's increasingly disturbing practices. An entry from 1865 reads, "I tried to send Rebecca away when the trader came. Josiah found out. He has taken her to the cave. When they return, she will be changed like the others." This cryptic reference to the cave appears multiple times in the journal, always in connection with punishments or with individuals who attempted to leave the family compound. No cave was documented in the official survey of the property, leading later researchers to speculate that it might have been located in one of the surrounding ridges, perhaps serving as both a place of confinement and as a site for whatever ritual practices Josiah had developed. A particularly disturbing entry from 1867 suggests that Margaret herself had become complicit in the family's practices, whether through coercion or psychological manipulation. "I helped prepare Sarah today. I told her it was a blessing. As Josiah insists, I showed her the marks to make and the words to say. May God forgive me for this lie. There is no blessing in what we do, only continuation of something that should have ended long ago." This entry suggests that by this point, Margaret had been forced into participating in preparing younger female family members for what appear to have been ritualized inbreeding practices. The authorities' immediate concern was determining the exact relationships between the various inhabitants of the Miller property. This proved nearly impossible. Many of the younger generations could not communicate coherently, and those who could speak offered contradictory accounts of their lineage. Dr. Porter attempted to create a family diagram based on physical resemblances and the limited information available, but abandoned the effort after filling 3 pages with overlapping lines that, in his words, more resembled a spider's web than any proper family tree. The county court records indicate that on December 12, 1884, Judge Thomas Wilson ordered the dispersal of the Miller dependents to appropriate institutions where they might receive care consistent with Christian charity. This clinical language masks what Hayes described in his journal as a scene of profound misery, the separation of family members who, despite the dysfunctional nature of their relationships, had known no other community, resulted in wailing that echoed through the courthouse and beyond. Sounds less human than animal, yet conveying human grief in their terrible intensity. A particularly troubling incident occurred during this process, documented in Hayes's journal but absent from official records. One of the younger women, who had been identified as a daughter of Rebecca, Josiah's eldest daughter, broke free from the officers, escorting her to the transport wagon. She ran not toward freedom, but back toward the courthouse where Josiah was being held, crying out in a language none could understand. When restrained, she bit her own tongue with such force that blood poured from her mouth. Yet she continued to make sounds that seemed to be calling to the patriarch. Josiah, hearing these cries from his cell, responded in the same unknown tongue, his voice carrying an authority that immediately calmed the young woman, who then went placidly with her escorts. The incident left all witnesses profoundly disturbed by the implication that the old man maintained some manner of control over his descendants that transcended normal familial bonds. Josiah was remanded to the Missouri State Asylum in St. Louis, where records indicate he died 3 months later, without ever acknowledging any wrongdoing. According to the asylum physician's notes, he maintained until his death that the world will one day understand the purity I have achieved. The fate of the other family members is documented in fragmentary fashion across various institutional records. Many apparently died within years of their removal from the isolated environment where they had spent their entire lives. The youngest children were placed in orphanages under new identities, an apparent attempt to give them the possibility of integration into normal society. Follow-up reports suggest that many struggled with both physical and social adaptation. The asylum records regarding Josiah's brief institutionalization contain several noteworthy observations. Dr. Ambrose Wilcox, the attending physician, noted that despite his advanced age and the primitive conditions in which he had lived, Josiah showed a surprising level of erudition on certain subjects, particularly ancient religious practices and genealogical theory. Wilcox recorded several conversations in which Josiah expounded on what he called the science of blood purity, citing obscure religious texts and historical precedents with a fluency that suggested he had received formal education at some point in his early life, a detail absent from the family's known history. When confronted with evidence of physical and mental degeneration among his descendants, he interprets these as transitional forms necessary for the achievement of what he terms the final perfection. He appears genuinely incapable of recognizing suffering in others, particularly in those he considers family. This clinical observation suggests that Josiah may have suffered from a profound form of delusional disorder, possibly exacerbated by decades of isolation and the unchallenged authority he exercised over his descendants. Most disturbing was Josiah's apparent lack of remorse, or even recognition that his actions had caused harm. The subject maintains that his family represents a superior line of human development. Wilcox wrote, Josiah's death on March 17, 1885, was recorded as resulting from pneumonia complicated by general debility, a common cause of death among elderly inmates in 19th century asylums. A notation in his file indicates that he refused all medication during his final illness, telling attendants that the pure do not require the mixtures of the corrupted. His body was buried in the asylum cemetery with no family members present for the interment. A final note in his file records that he spent his last hours writing continuously in a language unknown to any observer on any surface available, including his own skin when paper was removed from his reach. These writings, if preserved, have never been made available to researchers. What makes this case particularly notable in the annals of American history is not merely the disturbing nature of the Miller family's situation, but the apparent conspiracy of silence that followed. Within months of the intervention, official documents related to the case began disappearing from county records. Newspaper accounts, which had initially reported on the discovery with lurid fascination, abruptly ceased. By 1886, it was as if the Miller family had never existed. This systematic erasure is documented in correspondence between Sheriff Ledbetter and Judge Wilson, preserved by Ledbetter's grandson and made available to researchers in 1961. I concur that public knowledge of the full circumstances can serve no beneficial purpose. Ledbetter wrote in February 1885, "The reputation of our county and state would suffer unduly from association with such abnormality. Moreover, Those innocents who might yet be saved from their heritage deserve protection from the stigma of their origins. This letter suggests that the suppression of information about the Miller case was motivated by a combination of civic pride and paternalistic concern for the youngest survivors. Though later historians have questioned whether these stated motivations tell the complete story, a more sinister interpretation of the record suppression emerged in the 1960s, when historian Eleanor Poog discovered correspondence between Judge Wilson and several prominent Missouri families, suggesting that the Millers' isolation may not have been as complete as official accounts indicated. A letter from Wilson to State Senator Thaddeus Crawford, dated April 1885, contains the cryptic passage: "The matter we discussed regarding certain mountain folk has been resolved with complete discretion. All those with knowledge have been sworn to secrecy, and records are being handled appropriately. You may assure our mutual associates that no connection will ever be established." This oblique reference has been interpreted by some researchers as evidence that the Miller family may have had undocumented relationships with more respectable families in the region, relationships that powerful interests were eager to conceal. Dr. Harrington's 1953 investigation into the case met with consistent obstruction from local authorities. His research notes document repeated instances of being denied access to records that should have been publicly available. There appears to be a concerted effort to erase this incident from historical memory, he wrote. Elderly residents who would have been alive at the time refused to discuss the matter, changing the subject or claiming no knowledge despite evidence to the contrary. Harrington's notes describe how one elderly woman in Hollister initially began to share childhood memories of the Hollow people before being silenced by her son, who entered the room and abruptly terminated the interview. Harrington's research did yield one significant breakthrough. When he located Jacob Weaver, a former orderly at the Missouri State Asylum who had attended Josiah Miller during his institutionalization. Weaver, by then in his 90s, provided a detailed account of Josiah's final months. The old man wasn't like other patients, Weaver recalled. He had a power about him, even locked in that ward. The other inmates would do whatever he told them, and even some of the staff seemed to fall under his influence. Dr. Wilcox spent hours talking with him, taking notes, like a student with a professor. After the old man died, the doctor seemed changed somehow, more withdrawn, obsessed with genealogy and ancient religions. He resigned his position 6 months later and disappeared. Some said he went west to start a community of his own. This intriguing suggestion that Josiah's influence extended beyond his family, potentially affecting even trained medical professionals, adds another disturbing dimension to the case. If Wilcox did indeed fall under some form of psychological influence, it raises questions about the nature of Josiah's authority and whether it relied on more than simple patriarchal dominance. No record of Wilcox's subsequent activities has been found, leaving this aspect of the story unresolved. Harrington's persistence led him to discover a cemetery on what had been the Miller property, containing crude markers bearing only initials and dates. His field notes indicate that many of these dates clustered around certain years: 1862, 1870, and 1877, suggesting periodic events that resulted in multiple deaths. Soil samples he collected from the site were sent to colleagues at Washington University in St. Louis. But the results of any analysis were never published, and Harrington's correspondence from this period contains increasingly paranoid references to being watched and followed during his research trips to the Ozarks. In one particularly disturbing letter to his department chair at the University of Chicago, dated March 1957, Harrington wrote, I am now convinced that the Miller case represents something more significant than an isolated instance of degeneracy. The systematic nature of the record suppression, the continued reluctance of locals to discuss the matter 7 decades later, and certain physical evidence I have discovered suggest a phenomenon with deeper historical roots and possibly wider geographic distribution than initially supposed. There are indications that local authorities knew of the Miller situation long before the 1884 intervention, and that similar enclaves may have existed, may still exist in remote areas throughout the Ozark region. Harrington's notes from this period include references to other isolated communities he had begun to investigate, including one in the Buffalo River region of Arkansas and another in the remote eastern reaches of Oklahoma. He noted similarities in the patterns of isolation, unusual religious practices, and local reluctance to discuss these communities. There appears to be a shared origin to these cases, he wrote, suggesting either a common ideological source or possibly even direct connection between apparently separate communities. This theory of a broader network of isolated inbred communities remained speculative, as Harrington's research was cut short before he could fully develop it. In April 1957, Harrington traveled to Springfield, Missouri, to meet with an unnamed source who claimed to have access to sealed records related to the Miller case. He never returned from this trip. His abandoned car was discovered at a roadside rest area on Highway 60, approximately 30 miles from the former Miller property. The official investigation into his disappearance was closed after 6 weeks with no conclusions reached. His research materials, which might have provided the most complete account of the Miller case, were reportedly destroyed in a fire at his university office the night he disappeared, though conspiracy theorists have long maintained that the timing of this fire suggests a deliberate effort to suppress his findings. A curious footnote to Harrington's disappearance emerged in 1963, when a hiker in the Mark Twain National Forest discovered a tattered notebook wedged in a crevice of a rock formation near the former Miller property. The notebook, turned over to local authorities and subsequently transferred to the State Historical Society, contained entries in Harrington's handwriting dated April 15th through 17th, 1957, days after his reported disappearance. The fragmented notes describe his meeting with the unnamed source, who apparently showed him documents suggesting complicity at the highest levels of state government in concealing aspects of the Miller case. The final entry, partially illegible due to water damage, reads, "C. Found the cave. Matches running low. Strange markings on walls, similar to JB's book. Someone else has been here recently, I hear." The entry ends abruptly, providing no resolution to Harrington's fate. The most recent documented research into the Miller case was conducted in 1965 by historian Eleanor Pugh, who attempted to locate descendants of the family members dispersed to various institutions. Her findings, published in an obscure academic journal shortly before the publication was discontinued, suggest that several of the younger Miller women bore children while institutionalized, and that these children were adopted out with no record of their biological origins. The disturbing possibility exists, Pugh wrote, that descendants of the Miller lineage have been unknowingly integrated into the broader population, carrying forward genetic material shaped by generations of isolation and inbreeding. Pugh's research faced similar obstacles to Harrington's, many records proving mysteriously unavailable or having been destroyed in routine purges of archival material. Her article ends with a question that remains unanswered. Is the apparent effort to erase the Miller case from historical memory motivated by humanitarian concern for descendants who bear no responsibility for their origins? or by a deeper societal unwillingness to confront evidence that such extreme deviations from human norms could develop within our relatively recent national past. One significant discovery documented in Plug's research was the existence of a trust fund, established anonymously in 1886, to provide for the care of certain patients at various state institutions. The beneficiaries of this trust were identified only by numbers, not names. But Plug's cross, referencing of admission dates, strongly suggests they were Miller family members. The source of this funding remains unknown, but its existence implies that someone with considerable financial resources had an interest in ensuring the family's continued care, and perhaps their continued isolation from public scrutiny. The trust reportedly continued to disperse funds until 1932, when the last of the original beneficiaries is presumed to have died. Plug's investigation was cut short when she accepted a position at an Australian university in late 1965, abruptly abandoning her research into the Miller case. Her colleagues reported that she had become increasingly anxious in the weeks before her departure, claiming to have received anonymous threats warning her to discontinue her investigations. While no evidence of such threats was ever found, the pattern of researchers abandoning the Miller case under mysterious circumstances contributes to the aura of deliberate suppression that surrounds the incident. One intriguing aspect of the Miller case that neither Harrington nor Plug fully explored was the possible connection to local folklore, predating the family's arrival in the region. Vance Randolph's collection of Ozark folk beliefs includes several references to hollow folk, or hidden people, who were said to inhabit remote valleys and practice old ways that normal society had abandoned. While Randolph dismissed these as typical mountain superstitions, the parallels to the Miller situation are difficult to ignore. If such stories were circulating before 1851, it raises the possibility that the Millers were not the first to establish an isolated community in the region, but perhaps were continuing or reviving practices with deeper historical roots. This theory gains some support from archaeological evidence discovered during a 1962 survey of the Mark Twain National Forest. Archaeologist Robert Chambers documented the remains of what appeared to be earlier settlements in several remote valleys, including structures that predated European settlement of the region. His report notes that some of these sites showed evidence of continued habitation well into the 19th century, suggesting that some early settlers may have integrated with or adopted the lifeways of earlier inhabitants, rather than displacing them. Chambers' report includes the cryptic observation that some sites showed evidence of cultural practices inconsistent with documented settler communities, though he does not elaborate on what these practices might have been. Of particular interest is Chambers' documentation of symbolic markings found carved into rock faces near several of these settlements. Markings that bear no resemblance to known Native American petroglyphs or to typical frontier-era graffiti. These symbols appear to constitute a coherent system of notation, Chambers wrote, possibly related to astronomical observations or to some form of ritual calendar. The photographs included in his report show geometric patterns and stylized human figures arranged in circular formations, reminiscent of the circles of joining that Josiah Miller reportedly described to investigators. Whether there is a direct connection between these archaeological findings and the Miller case remains speculative, but the parallels suggest that the isolated basin where the family settled may have had a longer history of unusual habitation than previously recognized. The physical location of the Miller property has been reclaimed by the Ozark Wilderness. Aerial surveys conducted in 1960 showed no remaining structures. The access road had long since disappeared beneath new forest growth, In 1968, the land was incorporated into the Mark Twain National Forest, effectively sealing it away from further investigation. Forest Service maps of the area show no indication of previous habitation, marking the location simply as part of an ecological research zone closed to public access. This designation has fueled speculation among conspiracy theorists that the government continues to hide evidence related to the Miller case. While such claims lack credible evidence, it is true that access to the area remains restricted, ostensibly for environmental protection purposes. A Forest Service employee who requested anonymity told a local newspaper in 1997 that certain areas within the forest were off-limits, even to most staff, though he provided no explanation for these restrictions, beyond vague references to sensitive research projects. What remains of the Miller case today exists primarily as a whispered legend among longtime residents of the Ozark region. References to Basin people, or the Hollow Folk, occasionally surface in regional folklore collections, though always without specific attribution. The actual documentation remains scattered across partial records in various archives, many accessible only to researchers who already know exactly what they're looking for and where to look. Occasionally tantalizing new fragments of information emerge. In 2003, renovation of the old Taney County Courthouse uncovered a sealed metal box hidden within a wall cavity. The box contained a single document, a hand-drawn map of what appears to be the Miller property marked with symbols similar to those documented in Chambers' archaeological survey. The map bears no date or signature, but an inscription on the reverse reads simply, "Let this place be forgotten." County officials transferred the map to the Missouri State Archives, where it reportedly remains in restricted access storage, available only to researchers with specific authorization. A final disturbing coda to the Miller story emerged in 1969, when construction workers clearing land for a new highway near Branson uncovered a small cave containing human remains. According to the county coroner's report, these remains included the skeletons of at least 7 individuals, all showing signs of physical abnormalities, similar to those documented in Dr. Porter's private notes about the Miller family. Carbon dating performed on the remains indicated that they had been placed in the cave sometime between 1865 and 1870, corresponding to the period when Margaret Miller's journal made cryptic references to family members being taken to the cave. Most disturbing was the arrangement of the remains, which had been positioned in a circular pattern around what appeared to be a crude altar of stacked stones. The discovery received brief mention in local newspapers before the remains were quietly removed, reportedly transferred to the State Archaeological Department for further study. No published findings ever emerged. Inquiries about the discovery were met with claims that the remains had been misplaced during a departmental reorganization. This pattern of discovered evidence, followed by institutional amnesia, fits the broader pattern of information suppression that has characterized the Miller case from its earliest documentation. In 1998, a graduate student in forensic anthropology at the University of Missouri claimed to have located some of these remains in an unlabeled storage container in the university's anthropology department. Her preliminary analysis, documented in notes later provided to researchers, indicated genetic abnormalities consistent with prolonged inbreeding, including unusual cranial formations and evidence of polydactyly. Before she could complete her study or publish her findings, however, the remains were reportedly reclaimed by the State Archaeological Department and once again disappeared from the record. The student's academic advisor discouraged her from pursuing the matter further, citing political sensitivities surrounding the case. The case of the Miller family stands as a dark reminder of how completely a human community can disappear from historical memory, when its existence challenges our fundamental assumptions about society and family. It also raises disturbing questions about what other hidden chapters of our national story might lie buried in forgotten archives, or lost among the remote hollows of America's vast interior landscapes. Stories that, like the Millers, we have collectively chosen to forget rather than confront. As the light fades over the ancient ridges of the Ozarks, one can't help but wonder what other secrets these mountains keep. What other isolated hollows might harbor communities shaped by generations of separation from the broader currents of human development? The misty valleys reveal little to the casual observer, and the locals still maintain their traditional reticence toward outsiders, asking too many questions about the old days. Some stories, it seems, are better left untold. Some hollows are better left unexplored. But for those who know where to look, in the fragmented records, in the institutional histories, in the genetic legacy that may still express itself in subtle ways among descendants unaware of their origins, the Miller case remains a disturbing testament to what can develop when human communities turn too far inward upon themselves. It stands as a stark warning about the consequences of isolation, taken to its extreme conclusion. The most unsettling aspect of the Miller case may be not what we know, but what remains unknown. Buried in lost records, taken to graves by those who witnessed the intervention, or simply erased from official history by those who deemed the truth too disturbing to preserve. As with many of history's darkest chapters, we are left with fragments that hint at horrors we can only partially reconstruct, and perhaps that incomplete knowledge is a mercy rather than a historical loss. In the end, the mist-shrouded hollows of the Ozarks have reclaimed the physical evidence of the Miller legacy. The forest has grown over the foundations of their dwellings. Vines have covered the crude gravestones, and time has dissolved the material traces of their existence. But the questions their case raises about human nature, about the consequences of isolation, about our capacity to deviate from societal norms when removed from their influence, those questions remain, echoing softly through the hidden valleys where the Millers once carved out their disturbing, separate reality, and perhaps in some genetic thread passed down through generations. In some family line whose origins have been deliberately obscured, the Miller legacy continues, unrecognized, unacknowledged, but present nonetheless in the broader American bloodline. That possibility, more than any other aspect of this dark chapter in Ozark history, may explain why so many who know the full truth have chosen the comfort of forgetting over the disturbing implications of remembering. As night falls over the ancient hills, the wind whispers through the trees with sounds that might be mistaken for human voices. And somewhere in the deepest hollows, where sunlight rarely reaches, the echoes of the Miller story continue to resonate, a warning from our past that some boundaries exist for reasons beyond mere social convention, and that isolation can breed realities we struggle even to comprehend, let alone accept as part of our shared human experience.